So what do you think are the greatest mysteries of the history of ideas?
I think the one that fascinates me at the moment is I know of no theory or no book which explores the relationship between, on the one hand, political history, and on the other hand, cultural history. It seems to me that the history of ideas is very largely independent of politics, and I find that very, very surprising. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe somebody has the answer, but I have not found a clear link between these two dominant realms. And to me, that's the big mystery for me at the moment.
If you find that there's no connection between one and the other, I would have to ask you right now, what is an idea and where does it come from?
Well, yes, what is an idea? An idea is a thought, is an abstraction, or it's an action that embodies an abstraction. For instance, I was criticized at one point for calling the guillotine an idea. Now, you know, the guillotine, the method that was used to behead people in the French Revolution. Now, in fact, that guillotine was invented by a man called Guillotin, and the reason it was invented was that prior to the Revolution, there were about 200 ways that people could be killed in France legally, executed. They could be shot, they could be hung, drawn and quartered, they could be skinned, all of these things. And with the revolution, they decided to have just one way of executing people. This was the guillotine. So in a weird way, the guillotine embodies the idea of equality. Everybody wanted to have an equal life, and also in France in revolutionary times they had an equal death. So an idea was a thought, a theory, something that comes out of the mind, but can have obviously a practical effect and be embodied in material things. Once
the idea is conceived as coming of the mind, would you think it has to do with consciousness, of being aware of something, or it just maybe comes out of the blue, or, as you mentioned, the abstract world, or something like that?
Well, if you were to talk to, the French philosopher Henri Bergson said that the intuition is more important than the intellect. And of course Freud, as I don't need to tell you, said that the unconscious life was as important, if not more important, than the conscious life. This is a very contentious area. I am in general, although I don't deny that there is a subconscious, because obviously we don't at any one time remember everything that's happened to us, but we can call it up when we need to. But I do not accept that there is an unconscious of the kind that Freud said, that, you know, certain important influences on us in the first months of life actually affect our behavior and our thought patterns, and therefore our ideas much later on in life. I think that's a nonsense, and that there's not much evidence for it. I think most ideas come from our conscious life. They are an aspect of our intellect. There is such a thing as intuition, I think, but it's now, the most recent research calls it implicit or tacit knowledge, which means that as you go through life, you pick up things without perhaps paying full attention to them. But they get lodged in your mind, in your brain, and bit by bit they get assimilated into a theory or into a way of looking at the world. But I'm not a great depth man. I don't think that there are great depths to the mind that are hidden and remain to be discovered.
But would you think then intuition gives the possibility of going more in depth into maybe other realms of human consciousness?
Not really. no, I don't see what the evolution, if you look at this in an evolutionary way, I don't see what the evolutionary significance or purpose or use of that would be. I would resist efforts to make life more mysterious than it is. I think that that does people a disservice, that life is interesting enough the way it is, and there's no need to theorize about other realms which I don't think exist.
When you mentioned that the history of politics or the history of culture and those two realms are not connected, if when you in the book you talked about the Greeks and the political thought of democracy that they had. There was a huge effort from Plato, Aristotle, and all the philosophers involved into creating the democracy or the idea of politics behind it that affected the culture. You don't think that there's a connection there between the thoughts that were behind of creating the idea of politics that would affect the culture?
Yes and no, is what I think. After all, democracy emerged in Greece, but not representative democracy, which is what we have now. Mm-hmm. Democracy flourished in Greece in a particular way, in a particularly ideal way. But then when she was conquered by Macedonia, democracy fell and didn't really re-emerge until, what would you say, the early or middle Renaissance, with the republics in Italy, with that Genoa and Venice and Florence and so forth, where you began to have representative democracy. And again, you see, in classical Greece, to which you refer, you get the growth of what we might call science, though the Greeks didn't distinguish between science and philosophy in those days. But the scientific approach, that is to say, systematic observation and the construction of theories based on that observation, and then trying to see whether subsequent observations agreed with the theories, that developed in Greece also. But then again, it didn't really flourish until the scientific revolution in the 16th and 17th centuries. There was more than 1,000, more than 1,400 years, 1,500 years between these things. That's my point, you see, that there seems to be no logical progression in this. And is it, Francis Fukuyama says that democracies have evolved and we're all going towards liberal democracies. Well, the Arab world is now doing it, but not the Iranian world or the other worlds. So it's very much hit and miss, this development, I think. And it would be, I'm just waiting for somebody to point out to me what the link is between cultural and political history. Look at the history. I've just written a book about Germany. Mm-hmm. Look at the history of Weimar Germany between the end of the First World War and Nazism. Weimar Germany politically was a disaster. Huge amounts of violence, tyranny and so forth, but culturally, in painting, in music, in philosophy, in physics, it was a great success. So I am puzzled, this is the great mystery, by how a society can be a disaster politically and a great success culturally. It doesn't seem to add up, but it exists.
You think that it is Germany, the culture that has been the base for the Western world. Why would that be so? Why they created the basis for the Western world society and culture?
Well, I think Germany, again, this was a mystery to me at one stage. If you say, take 1750, the death of Bach, the birth of the modern world, Germany was still recovering from the 30 Years' War and intellectually was on its knees. But by 1933, it led the world. And so my book explores that transformation. And there you do have some sort of a link between political structure and culture, because in the 1750s, Germany was a long way from being unified. It was something like 300 states and free cities, and they had 300 courts. And because the courts were quite competitive, you had in Germany 50 universities around the turn of the 19th century, at a time when in Britain, for example, you only had 4. And this meant a great deal of cultural activity in Germany, and in particular, there was the habit of the courts paying for the bright sons, always the sons, never the daughters, the bright sons of poor people, and gave them a good education. And this, of course, promoted the great renaissance in culture and science that you got in Germany. But you still didn't get a fantastic reorganization in politics, not for some time. The cultural reformation or the cultural renaissance in Germany was a result of, in a way, of its political structure, its fragmented structure. But then it blossomed, and politics didn't really catch up for more than a century, well over a century. But that's why Germany led the way. It had this, it was the first, if you like, well-educated country in the world, I think. It had the first, they called it in German the Bildungsbürgertum, the educated middle class, and they had the first educated middle class.
How about France? I mean, because I understand that the first conception of university was by Peter Abelard in the 12th century when he created he's got this book about the treatise of universities, and so they had something quite interesting in the earlier centuries in France about education and dialectics more so than oratories. With
You're quite right. There was a renaissance in France in the 11th and 12th centuries with the creation of a number of universities there, but that never impinged on the middle class. That was always either clerics, the clerical class, or a few aristocrats. It never went very far down the social system. In the case of Germany, it extended much wider, and this is why you get the market for theatre and music in Germany in a way that went much wider than in France, even in France after the Revolution. And France has always had les grandes écoles, which are very good institutions, but they're very elitist. They don't really address, or they didn't anyway, at the beginning of the 19th century. France carried out some very interesting science, some very good science, but the education didn't spread too far beyond the elite, which is what happened in Germany.
Do you think maybe the influence of Martin Luther in translating the Bible into German had anything to do with this huge step that eventually Germany would do in spreading education to the middle class?
Absolutely, very good point. It had a very important effect in two ways. Translating the Bible into German, into the vernacular, enabled a lot more people to read it, of course, and that extended the education and the taste for books and the taste for reading. And then the other thing is that Germany, and to some extent they'd imported this from Britain, became a very pietistic, very serious country. And that was reflected through Luther and through the Bible and through many of the later intellectuals who governed German life. I say in my book, my German book, that vast numbers of German intellectuals are the sons of pastors. Angela Merkel, the current Chancellor of Germany, is the daughter of a pastor. And so these people did not want to be in the religious world like their fathers, but they did want to be in the serious intellectual world. They had lost their faith. But people like Nietzsche, his father was a pastor and so forth.
You believe that these intellectuals like Nietzsche and all these Immanuel Kant and all the philosophers, they really had an impact on the culture and how people behave?
Well, I think that it depends how you want to define that. I mean, you could say, and I would say, that Kant is probably the most important Western philosopher since Aristotle. And he had an enormous impact on the way his fellow academics, intellectuals thought. He had a big influence on the rest of us insofar as he was one of the first to say that our moral behavior comes from within us, not from God. And so that was a big change at the turn of the 19th century. So, that did impinge on a huge amount of people, and he had a big influence on the way we think of ourselves and the way we think of our interior life, and what we can say that is true and what we can say that is subjective and not true for everybody. So, yes, he had an enormous influence, but you can't sum up that influence in a couple of sentences. He wrote 3 big books, and one keeps coming across his influence, every week, if not every day.
Do you think this philosophy, which is, the love of wisdom or the search for wisdom, had maybe an impact in the development of psychology?
Yes, I think that what you get, the broad trajectory, if you like, of modern thought, is that you get the advent of religious doubt in a big way in the 16th and 17th centuries. And then, for a period from, let us say, the publication of Principia Ethica Principia Mathematica by Newton in 1689 until Darwin's The Origin of Species in 1859, you've got almost 200 years there where you have no theological concept of mankind, and the biological concept that Darwin will usher in hasn't arrived, as a result of which that is the great period of German philosophical speculation, the period of Kant, Hegel, Fichte, Schopenhauer, and so forth. And then, that in my view, an intermediate stage between the theological way of looking at humankind, and then the philosophical way, and then the modern way that occurs with Darwin and Nietzsche, and to some extent William James in America, and Freud, of course, the psychological way of looking at ourselves. And that is the modern way that we look at ourselves now, as psychological individuals, rather than as religious individuals or as machines, or as philosophical entities. I'm not saying that there aren't philosophers and there's no place for philosophy, but I think that we look upon ourselves now as both biological and psychological beings. So you're right, that change takes place.
You were mentioning about how many wars Germany has fought, even in centuries before the last one, and that you didn't find any correlation or any connection between the political thought and all the art and the culture that was glowing and growing so much. And just wondering, sometimes it seems that when humans are in a state of suffering or in a state of anxiety or fear, or those are 3 aspects that war brings out. At the same time, as a way of balancing, maybe this suffering or this anxiety can also help create the most wonderful inspiration for art and for writing and to discover many new aspects of a culture. Do you think that maybe there's a relationship there that could have stimulated the development of culture through all these difficulties that Germany was going through?
Well, I think that's a romantic idea, but I don't think there's a great deal to it. First of all, it's not true that Germany was very militaristic. There's been a study of this, and the beginning of and around the time of the First World War, the most military. If you want to define militaristic as the number of wars fought, in the 19th century, the most militaristic nation was the United States. It fought more wars, many of them small wars, than anybody else. Next came France, and Britain and Germany came sort of an equal third. The period 1815, the Treaty of Vienna, to 1914, the beginning of the First World War, 99 years, let's call it a century, was a very peaceable century. There were no major wars. There were skirmishes and conflicts, of course. But that was a very productive time, culturally, in terms of great advances that were made in science, the greatest period in the history of music, some very fruitful philosophy. The 19th century is still the greatest century of the novel, certainly the English language or German language or French language, and to some extent Spanish language novels. So, I think, suffering is a big word, and I think when people are really suffering in pain, that is such a narrowing experience that I don't think anybody can be creative when they're under physical pain.
I imagine you know the case of Viktor Frankl. He developed logotherapy while he was in prison, where he was able to survive. Do you know the case of Viktor Frankl?
I do. I've read a couple of his books, yes. You see, that's why I mentioned the word suffering. How are we to understand suffering? Wittgenstein wrote the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus during the First World War, and he wrote some of it when he was a student, a soldier, and he asked to have the most dangerous job, the point man, and there he found that he was obviously suffering, but he found it an exhilarating experience. But he wasn't physically suffering. He was psychologically suffering. Mm-hmm. I think, if you're in a concentration camp, obviously we have to be careful what we say here, but being undernourished, being a captive, is psychological suffering, and that can, I think, be very, in some people, creatively productive. But I think if in pain, you can't produce in pain. You have to wait until the pain is over. This is why you find, for example, the great raft of First World War novels. That was between 1925 and 1928, several years after the war. It takes time for the suffering to incubate. Mm-hmm. That's all I was going to say.
I guess I was not clear when I actually meant the psychological suffering, not the actual physical suffering of illness. And so thanks for letting me clarify that part.
Suffering is different,
yeah,
obviously,
it is.
And everybody experiences it differently. And of course, one way of coping with psychological suffering is creativity. This is all psychiatrists or psychotherapists will tell you that that's one of the ways of getting people to adjust to their situation, to invent and to make something of it.
I was reading Tolkien's biography. He mentioned that he was in the war, the First World War actually, and he was with his notes writing, and it was possibly a good way of letting go of all the anxiety and the fear that was coming through the war, I imagine. But it was like The Lord of the Rings has been an amazing science fiction book that has, touched people through mythology.
It's episodic. If you're in a war, the Libyan conflict at the moment is a little bit different because it's a civil war that's raging. But the nature of the First World War or the Second World War or whatever is that, periods of great danger interspersed with periods of quiet and calm. And of course, this is such a vivid, the danger is such a vivid form of existence that it clearly spills over into the periods of calm, and people feel the need to express themselves to make sense of what's happening. That, of course, can be very creative. But as I say, with the novels, it did take many writers a long time before they could actually assimilate it and face up to it.
Which do you consider is the best and most loyal way to transmit the beliefs, ways of life, and events from any civilization for future generations, say at least like 1,000 years later? Is it through myth or through written history? Because, you know, like we have the Bible that has been written as part of, like, you know, the religious thought, but also part of history, and it's been interpreted in so many ways. And so, do you think myth or written history would be the best way to convey what happened before?
Well, I don't think there's one answer to that question. My next book, which is published in January, is partly about myth. And it seems to me that most of our myths are warnings from the past, are ways of how to cope with disaster. And I think the age of myth is now past, but I think we can still tell our stories and to communicate information, which is what your question asked, in a mythic way, if we understand that as myth as being just a kind of way to simplify what's happening and draw attention to the high points. And this is why I think to tell future generations what our period is like, we need very, very specific narratives.
Like storytelling?
We also need more mythic stories.
Well, you know,
I think that our modern myths are really in the form of poetry.
Like in your book Ideas, as much as you go so much in depth into Europe, you don't mention very much Russia, and also when you go to the Americas, there's not much mentioning about like the South American or the Indian tribes or the Indian cultures. Like they have the Indians. The Indian tribes, their way to convey their histories through storytelling, and that is something that keeps very alive the history of the ancestors. I was just wondering, you know, like why was sort of Russia not too much taken into account in your book Ideas when you went so much in depth into Europe?
Yeah, well, I think that I do have a chapter on Indian thought. And I think that's quite comprehensive enough from what their intellectual achievement is. Russia was and still is a very backward country, socially and intellectually. And in the history of ideas, as opposed to the history of military conflict or the ruling families and so forth, it played very little part in what ideas were coming forward. And if you read, for instance, Chekhov or Turgenev or Dostoevsky, they're always going on about how backward they are in the realm of intellectual matters compared with mainstream Europe. And so, until the fluorescence of the Russian novel in the middle of the 19th century, there really is, there's very little in the realm of science, very little in the realm of philosophy. There is some theology, but don't forget that Russian culture was the most aristocratic of all. I mean, they really did not have, almost never have until now, a middle class. I mean, they had the landowning classes and the peasants. I mean, that's the big difference between, say, Chekhov and Ibsen, class of poetry Ibsen writes, but doesn't really exist in Russia. So that's what, there's not a lot to write about Russia, but I do have a chapter on Indian thought.
Why is it so important, the effects that anything can have on the middle class?
Oh, because it's a question partly of size. They're much more numerous than the aristocracy, and it is they who have the education to come up with the new ideas. The history of the 19th century is the history, and to some extent of the late 18th century, let's say 1750 to 1950, is the history of the rise of the educated middle class, and what we call high culture is the culture of the educated middle class, and then this is where most of the new ideas by which we live, the ideas of law, the ideas of philosophy, the novel, the ideas of romantic music, all of these things, architecture, theatre, all of these things are the culture of the educated middle class rather than of the aristocracy or the lower classes.
Would you believe that we have more and more middle class well-educated? Do you think that we can live without governments? Can we reach the level of being self-governed?
Well, I think I said 1750, 1950. I think since the Second World War, the classes have broken down more or less everywhere, and there's now much wider access to education, and so we're now living in more and more educated societies. But I do not feel that in the past, put it like this, you had an elite, the educated middle class formed an elite, and that gave them a certain sort of coherence and shared beliefs. And I don't think that exists anymore with a much wider access to education. That is not the shared amount of beliefs. I mean, I don't know whether you do any lecturing. I do some lecturing, and I just don't know these days what people know. And I don't know whether my lecture is telling them what they already know, or I'm speaking over their heads. So to answer your question, I think that makes it much more difficult to live without government. I think we need government now more and more. I mean, we need clearer laws at a time when there are more exceptions to the laws than ever before.
So if education plays a major part in in the development of a culture, what is your feeling about this modern education that we have at the Western world, considering that, like, for instance, in the early centuries, like, mathematics was studied as a philosophical principle, or people studied all the kinds of things, but with a completely different focus. And so, like, mathematics, it seems to be studied today not as a mystical or like a very profound a philosophy that could be the language of the universe, but as a way of summing up how much one has and how much one doesn't have. So we know that education is the basis for everything, but it seems that this Western world, the style of education we have, something's missing. What is your feeling about this kind of education that we have in this modern world?
I was interested in your point about mathematics and philosophy, and maybe we can come back to that. I think what seems to be behind your question is right, is a doubt about what actually we're doing. It seems to me that we run the risk, there's such an explosion of knowledge that what we need is agreement on areas of what you might call coherence. I mean, we hear so much about you can't be certain about everything, but there are areas of coherence in biology, in mathematics, in sociology, and so forth. And it's a little bit like there's been so much specialization now and fragmentation that books like the one that we're discussing are valuable, if only because they bring it all together. And my feeling of the people I meet, and it goes to what I was just saying about what you don't know what people know, is there's no general agreement about what is important. And this is, I think, the negative achievement of the postmodernists, who basically say that culture is a carnival and one piece of information is as colorful and therefore as valuable as another. And I just don't think that's true. I think that there is a broad narrative to the world. It's very broad. There are lots of exceptions. But I think that, there are a broad number of things that we should all know, that all children of a certain age should know. Not just because they're more important than other bits, but if we are to live together, then we need to know what knowledge there is. It's much easier to share life if we share knowledge. And I think that when you look around you, there is. And one of the points of my book was to say, this is what there is. This is the central core element. Now, it's a big book. I accept that because there's a lot, and obviously there's a lot that's been left out. But I do think, we need a core curriculum, if you like, and that we ought to be able to agree broadly on what it is, while always acknowledging that you can't insist on your own particular choice, but that we should aspire to this core body of knowledge.
Now, obviously, knowledge is not the same as wisdom, and it seems, at least from my perspective, maybe my experience of studying in the universities or schools, that the orientation or the focus of the teachings is much more theoretical than it is practical. And as you mentioned before, that it would be great that people would know and understand how electricity came about to be by going through the process that Franklin or whoever's behind, or Edison behind the electricity thing, how they did it, because in that way people would get to understand in a practical way how things came to be. And it seems that modern education is completely theoretical, and that goes only to, like, for instance, to the head, but that's it.
Yes, I mean, where do you draw the line? You see, I would be in broad sympathy with what you say, and where I would start is that I think everybody should have a decent medical knowledge of their own body, and they should regard their own body as their own property as it is, and they must care for it throughout their life, and know in a broad way how it works and how it can be looked after. I start there because I think the body is the most important thing that you can have. I include the brain, obviously, the most important thing about us. Do you think that everybody should know how a car is organized? Should everybody know what goes on inside a computer? I don't know the answer to that. It may be too much for everybody to know, but I would be broadly in agreement with you over understanding how electricity works and so forth. But not everybody is going to find that very interesting. Whereas I think that we all have bodies. And again, it's we could find a place to agree or not agree. I would start with saying we do need to understand our bodies. I don't, to be honest, understand much about how cars work. But at our stage in history, cars hardly ever go wrong. I certainly don't understand how aeroplanes work, and they go wrong even less. So is it necessary for me to have that practical information? I don't think it is, but I agree that it's necessary to have some practical information. But, or maybe I'm misunderstanding you.
Yes, you are understanding me, but I think I'm missing maybe one thing in the question I was placing. And now that you mentioned, it came clear to me. Like when we learn in a practical way how to do something, then we are teaching ourselves through a different method that can help us develop our own creativity. Whereas if we just have to read books and then give an exam of whatever we memorized of a book, then we teach ourselves to think that way, because that's how we learn to think. And so I was wondering if by being able to be more practical in the education in a way that we are able to do things so we can learn in a more direct connection to whatever we are reading through, then we can probably develop a way of thinking that is a bit more creative than just stagnated in theory.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting how you do this. I mean, I've got two examples from my own life. I trained in a psychiatric clinic, and one of the things that you learn is that patients who come into the clinic, they have a certain condition which is in the textbooks, but it's nothing like it says in the textbook. Mm-hmm. And you learn in a different kind of way by seeing patients than reading textbooks. And I also, much later in life, did 10 years in the archaeology department at Cambridge. And of course, you learn a very different archaeology if you go on an excavation than if you just read books. So I agree with you that there are practical sides to life, which are different forms of knowledge, and they certainly amplify and extend book knowledge, because they are in very real ways different. And so if what you're suggesting is that in all forms of learning we should have more practical activities, and I would say that from my experience that's absolutely right, that practical learning on the job vastly extends what you learn in books. I know architects and engineers would say the same thing. I mean, some subjects are just much more practical than others.
You also wrote a lot about the Oriental philosophies and the Oriental ideas, and there's a definite distinction between Oriental and Western philosophy. What would you think is the major differences between these two philosophies, or way of seeing things and expressing them through philosophy, and the way these philosophies have impacted the cultures in the different worlds?
Well, I think there are several differences. I think that basically we go back to Greece and the Aristotelians who looked at the world and thought that it could be known by observation, and eventually that meant by experimentation and testing. Whereas I think the great Eastern philosophers are achieved by a sort of inward reflection, observation of one's thoughts and reactions in a very realistic way, I have to say. And this is why many in the West are drawn to these philosophies. But of course, it is the looking out, the Aristotelian way, that eventually led to what we call science, and that is the big difference between the East and the West. Of course, these things are all breaking down now, but we're talking about history. And if you read someone like Ernest Gellner or A.N. Whitehead, they all say that the Chinese system of mandarins, intellectual leaders who work directly to the emperor, could never have conceived of science, because they work by consensus rather than conflict or competition. And there are various reasons as to why that happened in Greece. It's a lot of little islands. It was a trade way station, so there was always a lot of competition amongst traders and so forth. But that, I think, is in a nutshell, oversimplifying, is the essential difference, that China and India never really developed science.
What part does language play in the development of culture and science? Because, the ideograms that the Chinese use, they're images, whereas we in the Western world use very, direct words for things. So do you think that language has a great part in the development of the culture and maybe the development of science or things like that?
The wording, writing has a big influence. That an alphabet is a much more efficient way of conveying ideas than the Chinese ideograms, and this encouraged linearity. The linear nature of the alphabet encouraged linearity of thought. The formation of words between consonants and vowels helped in the development of abstract thought. It helped in poetry, in the development of rhyme, which was a big discipline on many poets that pushed them forward. So I would think that what the real interest is not so much language as writing, which obviously is a form of language, and that's had a big effect on development of Western thought as distinct from the Chinese thought.
I have a question regarding ancient civilizations. Like, do you think, because, if you're very fond of Darwin's evolution theory, it would seem like we have been evolving as humans and our development of our brains and our concepts and everything like that. But do you believe there were probably other civilizations, ancient civilizations that were more advanced than we are now?
No. There's no evidence for that, and we now, the world is not completely covered with archaeologists, but I don't think that we've found anything that provides evidence of civilizations before we know it. We know, and if there were people, obviously, and there were activities, but if by civilization you mean monumental buildings and communal living in cities, then no, these begin, not simultaneously, but not too dissimilarly across the world, and there is no evidence for anything before that.
So how can the Great Pyramids of Egypt can be explained? Because, modern architects and engineers are completely unable to build something like the pyramid in Giza has 2 million stones, and it's supposed to be have built in 20 years, which means like one stone put in a perfect place every 2 minutes. So that's something that we cannot do nowadays, but it existed from way ancient times. And so how could you explain this phenomena of building something like the pyramids in such a perfect alignation with everything, and not be something that we can replicate nowadays if we are more advanced?
I think we probably could replicate it if we put our minds to it, but there's no need and no call for it. I don't really believe that these books that say that one stone was put in every 2 minutes. I think that's a physical impossibility. If that's what they do say. I mean, there is a civilization in Egypt at the date we know. In fact, before the development of the arch or development of concrete, a pyramid is more or less the only form that you can build a large building in, because that's what happened in the other side of the world at more or less the same time in South and Latin America. In Peru and so forth, you have pyramids there. They're not built of stone, I accept that. They're built of clay bricks and so forth. But they're smaller, but there's certainly not evidence of any earlier civilization or any early capability that has since been lost. I don't see that at all.
If you believe like we are in a evolutionary process, then would you say that monotheistic religions are more evolved than paganism?
No, just differently. I mean, my next book, which I finished, comes out in January.
What's the title of the book?
It's called The Great Divide, but you'd be more interested in the subtitle, which is How Civilizations Develop Differently in the Old World and the New.
Okay.
And I show quite clearly there how religion in Eurasia differs from the ancient religion. This is all pre-Columbian, obviously. How religions in Eurasia differed from the early religions in the Americas. And it's completely related to weather, to vegetation, to the local landscape and the animals and so forth. And so in the Americas, you never got the development of monotheism. You have in America something like 90% of the psychoactive plants in the world. So you have the shamanisms of Central and Mesoamerica and the Andes and Peru and Chile and Bolivia and Tiwanaku and so forth. And I explain all this. I mean, it seems to me that religion is a natural development to the surroundings that people find themselves in and the threats, either real or imagined. And of course, this year is a classic El Nino year, as you will know better than me. And El Nino has had the increasing frequency of El Nino in the New World has had a very big influence on the development of religions there. And the New World religions are quite different from the Eurasian religions.
Why do you think that the psyche or the human nature has had a need to create an idea of God?
Well, I think it's fairly simple, isn't it? It's that people are puzzled by the mystery of existence. They're puzzled by the mystery of the heavens and the curious behavior of the sun. In a time before we knew about orbits, comes up one day and gets swallowed up into the earth later that day. The mystery of volcanoes, earthquakes, and so forth. And they sought to explain that. And that's what religion is, an explanation and a comfort, therefore, of the mighty forces that surround us, in which we both don't understand, nor do we control. And so we try to petition the gods either to make the rains come so it becomes fertile, or not to have volcanoes spewing stuff at us, or no tsunamis or anything like that. That seems to me, when you look at it and when you look at the form that the gods take, and I've used in my new book, the New World and the Old World as a kind of natural laboratory, because they're widely separated in space. They are differently configured, their vegetation is different, their weather is different, the climate is different, the animals are different, the whole of life is different, with the result that the civilizations and the gods that were developed are quite different. There are some similarities because the human predicament is the same, but the differences are really much more interesting.
Do you think that we are spirits in nature, like that we have a soul, or that we are spirits in nature, and maybe that's the origin to the creation, one of the possible stimulations to create religion?
No, I don't think we're any different. I think that's one of our problems. We keep thinking that we are different. Human beings have language, and therefore no other animal, so far as we know, has anything like a developed language as we have it. We have writing. Nobody else has. No other species has that. And I see no evidence for the soul. I know of nobody who's come back from the dead, or anybody who's spoken to anybody who's on the other side, any credible way. So I'm afraid I'm a complete materialist. We live here for a short time and then we die, and that's it, and enjoy it while you can.
Now, I imagine you know about Einstein's theory of relativity and the unified field theory, and he demonstrated that everything is energy, and so we are also energy, and that energy doesn't die, but it transforms. So in that way, what would you believe? I mean, when we die, we transform into some sort of energy, or what happens?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are organic energy, and we transform into soil, and soil is both organic and inorganic, and we decay into a mixture of both organic energy and inorganic energy. The organic energy goes to help the growth of plants, as does the inorganic energy, and other animals feed on the plants and reproduce, and it goes on in that sort of cycle. But I don't think that we need to invoke any supernatural power for that. I mean, the chemical processes are well understood. Okay, the mystery of what life actually is not fully understood, but I have no doubt that in time, perhaps not in my lifetime, it will be understood. Whether we want to be around, I don't know. Would that be an altogether happy experience? I don't know. We're going to hit, what is it? The globe is going to hit 7 billion population in the next month or so, and that's a chastening figure.
How sacred do you think the sacred scriptures really are?
Well, I don't think they're sacred. I think they're instructive. I think they teach us a lot, viewed as anthropological or archaeological or historical documents. Scriptures teach us about the past, about the problems that people faced and the solutions they tried, which had either worked or not. So I think that they're very useful documents, but I don't think that they're sacred in the sense that they're old and they're special. But I don't think that they're sacred in that they come from the Word of God. I don't think, I mean, that's obviously not true of the Bible. There are various versions of the Bible. It was written down long after the events. And, it's been constantly updated and changed and revised. And why not? But not sacred in the sense of holy, no.
In the Eastern cultures, they believe a lot about reincarnation, and they believe about the human soul and these sorts of things. Would you think, from your perspective, that they are in the wrong path, or that they have not reached a clear understanding of what life is about, or is it something different that you believe about them?
Well, I've just come back from Burma, which is a Buddhist country, and where you're never more than a kilometer from a stupa or a temple. And I think the chief achievement of Buddhism is creating a fairly docile and maybe happy people. But I don't know all the things that they say they believe. They don't, when you talk to them, they don't say it with any conviction. It's a habit ingrained in them and their ancestors for many years. But I have my suspicions about many Buddhists, that they're not anywhere near as holy as they are said to be. Nor do I think they believe in what they believe in anywhere near as strongly as they're said to. I'm somewhat suspicious of it, to be honest. But I was only 2 weeks in Burma, so maybe I'll go. I am going again, and maybe I'll change my mind. What
events in the known history you consider that have mostly impacted the way the modern humans are here in the Western world?
Well, there's an obvious answer with Christianity, but I think it would either be the growth of the universities in France in the 11th and 12th centuries, or the scientific revolution in the 16th and 17th centuries, which I think transformed the way we look at ourselves, the way we look at the world, the way we understand the world can be understood. That, for me, would be the big events that have changed, that have brought us to the point where we are now, where you and I are having this conversation thousands of miles apart.
Do you consider the Americas to be part of the Western world, or is your idea of the Western world more just like Europe and all the, the history and the richness of everything that Europe has?
Well, if we'd been having this conversation 25 years ago, we would have used a phrase then that we haven't used now, which is the Third World. Mm-hmm. And the Third World existed against the First World and the Second World, which of course was Russia. Well, the Second World has disappeared, and the Third World has largely disappeared because huge areas of the world have now joined the First World rather than the West. That's Europe and North America. Huge areas of probably South America. Russia is trying to join the First World. India, China, and Southeast Asia have left the Third World and joined the First World. The Arabs of North Africa are trying to join the First World. That's the way I would look at it. I think that the Western approach has won, or is winning. Now, it may not be Westerners who win. It may be the Indians and the Chinese and the South Americans who win in the long run. But this approach, the scientific materialist approach, has, for all its faults, and despite what many people say, has I think triumphed. I do think that's true.
The economic system is part of this materialistic focus of life in the Western world, and it seems to be going through major trouble lately, major crisis. Do you think that this could be a starting point to the failure of the economic system and the creation of something new?
Well, I think that the economic system could implode still. I think that's true. But I don't think, the economic system will have to start again. I don't think it's the start of anything radically new in a philosophical or the way we live together sense. I don't see that happening at all. What we are seeing everywhere is the development of freedoms, not just economic freedom, but psychological freedom, sociological freedom, freedom to think, freedom to write, freedom to talk. That is the imperative of the modern world in which we live, and I don't see that, I have to say, changing. The only thing that the only thing that could change that is obviously what's happening to the climate and what's happening to the population. The world could become inhabitable, not overnight, but or in the near future. But the way things are going, areas of the world could become uninhabitable, and there may be very ugly confrontations as a result of that.
Is that not a subject of your favorites, the politics issue?
Well, I always, we live with politics every day, and one of the things I've thought about writing about ideas, is this helps us get away from politics, to relax and look at other things that make life worth living.
Yeah, you mean maybe having a war over water?
Exactly. Yes, war over water. I think that you've got, for instance, a very crowded China, and north of that you've got a very empty area of Russia with water, with timber, with oil, with industrial diamonds. That could become an area of conflict in the future, I think. Obviously Mexico is going through its own troubles at the moment, which are quite serious, I think. It seems to me that America has to legalize drugs. So the only way to cope with the problem of cocaine is to legalize it. No other system would work. That wouldn't be a perfect solution, I accept. But elite. The money has to be taken out of that situation. But now we're talking politics.
As you were mentioning the things that are happening in this world, do you see it coming, maybe a third world war? Do you think that's maybe possible it can happen?
Yes, I think it could. Obviously the Middle East is still a tinderbox, and what is happening in the Arab world could change the balance of power there. Russia, I think, is less stable than it seems, and it's vast. It could always, I mean, when you consider that Moscow to Vladivostok is the same distance as London to Los Angeles, you know, and it's one country, I can see Russia breaking up at some point, and that could create a war that might spread either with India or with China, as I said. Those seem to me to be the flashpoints. Africa is still fairly unstable, but I would think that would be fairly contained. I don't see that breaking out into a major, wider war.
And what positive things do you see coming from the process that we've lived up today, and that we could see results in our scientific world or our cultural life? Any nice, interesting things that you see maybe developing or coming?
Well, yes, I think that stem cell research will revolutionize medicine, that people will be able to grow their organs. I think that people are waiting for a big breakthrough in cancer, but I think there are lots of little breakthroughs happening all the time. And I think that, you know, medicine is the most obvious way, I think, of where things will improve. Beyond that, I think it's relatively difficult. I think South America is still quite empty, so it's a better place than most. I know you have some big cities, but you also have a lot of empty. I was in the Amazon a few months ago, and wow, that's such a huge empty place.
Well, we sort of need it, you know. It's like we need it because we breathe from it. So it would be cool that it just stays like the rainforest.
Absolutely.
But unluckily, it seems that that's not going to happen, because, you know, as long as money and greed are the means of living in this modern world, we're just going to maybe step on each other to get what we want.
Yeah, that's true too. Yeah.
That's a sad truth about our human nature. But as long as we don't change the systems, what systems do you think have shaped modern humanity? Like, you know, maybe politics, religion, economy. What systems do you think they have shaped?
I mean, it's a way to wind up. I mean, I think, you know, in countries like Britain, I don't know where you are, but it's the same with you, but socialism has a dirty word. However, if you rephrase it and talk about civic responsibility, this, I think, is the most important thing facing us now. You have this with the banks. The bankers are being irresponsible. They're putting their own interests before that of the community. And this seems to me to be the way forward, that we have to think up new ways of living together, of being together, and cooperating, and exercising civic responsibility, because otherwise it's going to, with so many people in the world and with them being so mobile, with so many migrants who have no particular loyalty to the area in which they're living, that civic responsibility is the big thing for the future. And that it's going back to, we talk about education, you know, children should not just be taught, pupils should not just be taught practicalities about their body, as I was saying, but the practicalities goes back to your point about practical education. They shouldn't just be taught the theory of socialism or communism or free markets. they should be shown in a practical way what we can do to live together. And in Soviet times in Russia, they used to have something called Subotnik, and Subot is the same word as Shabbat, Sabbath, Sabbath. And on Saturday mornings, people used to work half a day for the state. Now, that was compulsory in a Soviet system, but I think that that's something that we could well introduce or reintroduce, that people work half a day a week for nothing for the state. And we all do it. Not just you or me or volunteers, we all do it.
Yeah.
And that would bring us together, I think. Well, do something other than your other job.
Exactly. Do you think like civil responsibility, as you mentioned, includes our relationship to nature and to the animal kingdom and the vegetable kingdom? And
you could include that in, let's call it Subotnik for the sake of this conversation. You could do that. You wouldn't have to work in a city soup kitchen, although you could do that. You could work in the fields, you could work in the forests, you could work on the beaches. Yes, you could work with animals. There's a piece on the television today in Britain about acorns and how we're looking after our acorns so that we can grow the best trees. And somebody is giving 1 day a week to doing that, and I think this should be extended. But we all have to do it. I think it should come.
Yeah, it seems that, economy actually depends very much from the natural environment. And though there are very few economists that really have delved into understanding that the economy depends totally on the natural world, it seems that this is being more relevant as we are losing it more and more. And so it seems that to come into some sort of harmony and equilibrium in the way we live, which is a very it's not a point of equilibrium that's static, but rather changing with every day that is so different. We need to sort of go back, even if we live in the cities, to have a better relationship to our natural world if we are ever going to actually survive. Don't you think?
Yeah, I agree with that. Yes, I think, and as I say, and I'm making the point that it shouldn't just be having lessons. We should all be practically involved, and it's up to governments to give a lead and to take us away from our selfishnesses. I mean, the one thing that we haven't talked about, and I really do have to go in a minute, is individualism. That we live in a very individualistic world, and we really have to teach children that there's more to life than individualism.
Like learn to live in community.
The precious thing the most precious thing that we can do.
Yes, definitely. Well, Dr. Watson, I really want to thank you for the time you've given us. And
I enjoyed it.
I enjoyed it too.